So this video is going to compare photos taken with three 50mm lenses for Canon. There's going to be the 50mm 1.2 EF mount, the original 50L, the Canon 50, the Sigma 50 1.4 art for Canon mount, and then the RF 50 1.2L, which is the 50 1.2 that was made specifically for Canon's mirrorless bodies. I do own all three of these lenses, although I'm going to likely be selling 1 to 2 of them in the near future. I do own a mirrorless camera. I have the Canon EOS R, which is what all these example photos were shot on. I have had the original 50 1.2 for many years. It's a beautiful lens. It has a very unique rendering. It's great for me for documentary photography. I don't really use it much for client work except for newborns just because of my style of shooting, but I use it for a lot of other stuff, for just personal documentary, for travel. Again, I do use it in the studio for newborns, and I sometimes do use it for toddlers in my studio as well, depending on what we're doing. And the Sigma Art I've had for a little under a year. I got it brand new. I actually did not purchase it. It was given to me. It's a really long story, but I've owned that one. I like how it performs. I don't love it, but I am much happier with it on my mirrorless body, as the focus is much better there. It did have some focus wonkiness, or it does, on my 5D Mark IV. Not terrible, but kind of par for the course, which I've experienced with a lot of Sigma Art lenses, but it's really decent on my mirrorless body. And now I also have the 50 1.2 RF mount lens. This is the first RF mount lens that I have, the mount that's made specifically for the Canon mirrorless bodies. I got a really killer deal on it, which is why I bought it, and I'll probably be unloading possibly both of my other 50s, depending on how I feel, although I'm not sure I can get rid of my original 50L. But I wanted to do this video because, again, somebody had asked me a long time ago to compare the 50 1.2 Canon and then the Sigma 50 Art up against each other. And I decided to do that, but also then, since I now have the RF, throw that in there as well, just in case anybody has a situation where they're looking at either all three of these lenses, or maybe you just have a DSLR and you're looking at two. You can just see photos side by side from all three lenses. I can post pictures in a blog, which is great, and I will do that. However, seeing videos like this, for me, where people zoom in on pictures and just kind of compare side by side a little bit more, is really super helpful to see. So when I did this video, or when I actually did these pictures, I took 3 different poses. I took the same exact picture, same pose with 3 lenses. I shot them all wide open just because I wanted to show the wide open performance of each lens. It may not be all the time that you're going to shoot a lens wide open, especially with a 1.2 lens, depending on the situation. However, obviously, if you have a lens that shoots at 1.2 or 1.4, you're going to at least want to use it part of the time at a wide open aperture. And that's where a lens is weakest, is wide open, but I want to show you how it performs at its weakest point. So this is the first pose, and with every single pose, it's going to be the same order: the 50 1.2 EF, the Sigma Art, and then the RF. And I'm going to just kind of compare and contrast them. This is obviously a portrait orientation shot, full body. This is the Canon EF lens. She is obviously in focus if we look at this picture at this kind of full view, and nothing looks really wonky at this full zoomed out view. I did want to make sure I wasn't blowing out her shirt, which was light colored in any of these pictures. If we zoom in, we can see that she is in focus. We can see her eyelashes. The Canon 50 1.2, the EF mount, does have a phenomenon called veiling haze wide open, where it has almost like a kind of like low contrast look. Almost, it looks like a haze over the picture, depending on what you're taking the picture of. I notice it more with people, taking portraits of people, or sometimes just scenes with low contrast. If I take pictures of my dog, who is extremely dark my dog has black fur and very dark eyes with orange rings in them. It doesn't really happen because there's kind of, it just doesn't show up in really high contrast items, or people or pets or what have you. It is slightly noticeable in really most portraits of any type of person, or again on any other low contrast scene. So you can see a little bit of haze here. If you don't know what you're looking for, you might not see it. I see it just because I notice it. But you can see the details in her eyelashes. You can see detail in her eyebrows. There's a slight bit of chromatic aberration, very light noticeable on her sleeves here. That can be fixed in post-processing. And really nothing major of note. Again, a little purple chromatic aberration here. We can see just obviously there's blur behind her. This has a very, very typical Canon 51.2 look. Again, I said it was very, very characteristic look that this lens has. This is a straight out of camera, as are all of the pictures in this video. This one right here is the 51.4 art. The first thing I notice if you look at each of these pictures side kind of back forth, is that the 51.4 art actually looks like it's a tiny bit wider than the 50L. I did not move, nor did she. I actually had somebody handing me the lenses back and forth while I was doing this, and you can see that there's just a bit wider. I did tilt a little more too, but on that 50 art. The other thing is, the 50 art, if we're going again back and forth, this is kind of like a little movie, is a little bit warmer. That's typical of Sigma lenses. If you shoot them, Sigma art lenses are a bit warmer than Canon lenses. I don't want to say that this is necessarily good or bad or anyway, it's just a fact. So same pose, if we zoom in, we can see that there's definitely more detail in the eyelashes here. There's just more detail resolved. The Canon is sharp, as is this lens, but there's actually more detail that we can see in her eyelashes and her hair, a bit more contrast. There's actually not too much chromatic aberration in this picture at all. The Sigma doesn't have much of it, which is pretty fancy. That's a good thing. If I look at these pictures side by side with the Canon and the Sigma, you can obviously see that one is warmer than the other. The Sigma is warmer. This is the Canon here on the right. You can really see it kind of in the grass. A lot of these grass tones, these are a lot more blue, whereas these are more yellow. You can see it in her skin as well. This yellow back here is a little warmer, but it's definitely more prevalent in the grass. If we zoom in, you can clearly see that Sigma has more detail. Apparently it's time for my nap. In just kind of overall here, it's not that this picture is out of focus or is unsharp, it's just that the Canon doesn't resolve quite as much detail. There's just a bit more in her hair, in her eyelashes. Both of these are extremely usable photos. Again, we're zooming in 1:1, and this is a shot taken from a fair distance, where she's a portion of the scene as opposed to the whole scene. One thing that's really interesting to know about the Sigma is that even though it does not open as wide as the Canon, you would think that the Canon would have better background blur at 1.2 versus 1.4. The Sigma does seem to have a little bit smoother blur, if we look. So this is the Sigma here. This is the Canon. The Canon, the out of focus points of light, aka bokeh, which I hate that word, are larger due to the larger aperture. However, they don't necessarily blend into each other as well. They're very differentiated, if you can tell that. The Canon also has cat eye bokeh, which is, I don't mind it. The Sigma's rounder. However, it's just not as smooth. And then if we go, I'm just going to zoom out here, hopefully. If we go into the corner, you can see that the Canon on the right here has this really, really wonky out of focus points of light or bokeh here in the corners. It looks like kind of these crazed gumdrops or ghosts from Ghostbusters or something, or Pac-Man, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, there's a bunch of Pac-Man ghosts just running across here. It's very bizarre. Whereas this is a lot more smooth and organized. You can also see there's a little bit of green chromatic aberration as well. Even purple here on the out of focus points of light. So the next one I am going to look at is going to be the RF 51.2. This one is again a little bit cooler toned, more typical Canon with the cooler tones. It's actually not quite as cool as the original Canon EF lens. However, it does have more of a typical Canon color look to it. Again, she's in focus. If we zoom in, you can see there's quite a bit of detail in her eyelashes, in her eyebrows, in her hair, just kind of everywhere, which is great because that's what we want for a lens that's obviously costing us this much money. But for a 1.2 lens, this is great detail. I am going to do a quick side-by-side comparison, if I can get these two up here, of the two 1.2 lenses next to each other, just so you can kind of see the difference between the old one and the new one. Obviously, the newer one has much more detail that it's resolving. Again, this is a very usable picture here on the right, even at 1.2. This one's just got more detail that we're seeing and a little bit more contrast. One thing I was a little bit worried about was that the background blur of the new RF lens was not going to be smooth, or it might be a little bit too contrasty, just because a lot of times lenses that are newer like this is actually kind of happens with the Sigma Arts, even their background blur can tend to be contrasty. And not as pleasing, at least just to me. That's, I guess, an objective statement. But you'll see that this background blur is actually quite nice, quite smooth here, these out of focus points of light. This fade here, kind of this fade into on the path, I think arguably it's slightly better or slightly smoother on the original 50L. As opposed to the new one. That could just be because the newer one's showing a bit more detail. But to anybody who's not looking for this, you're never going to notice. Alright, so then my next picture that I took is a shot that I don't typically really use a 50mm lens for. I don't really take portraits like this with a 50mm because it just tends to have a little bit too much perspective distortion for me. However, I did want to show kind of a range of different shots of a person. There are some people who do portraiture more close up with a 50, and I also again wanted to show something that had a bit more detail. So this is just a kind of head and shoulder shot at 1.2 with the original EF lens. If we zoom in, we can clearly see her eyelashes here. They're pretty detailed, they're sharp. We can see her eyebrow details. Her nose is sharp here on the sides. It's starting to be a little fuzzy here, just barely. That's just because of the depth of field. We have detail on her lips. We can see a little bit of that haze on her hair here as it tends to fall out of focus. There's a tiny, tiny bit of green chromatic aberration on her shirt here as it meets the background, that high contrast area. Again, fixable in post-processing. Nice skin tones. All in all, this is a decent shot for sure. Not necessarily something you'd always really shoot at 1.2. Something this close, just because you're dealing with a portrait where you might want to show a little bit more detail. You might stop down a little bit, maybe f2, 2.8, something like that. But I wanted to show what it's capable of, wide open. So that is the Canon 1.2 EF. This is the same shot taken with the Sigma. She turned herself a little bit, but it's comparable enough. Again, both eyes are in focus here. Very sharp, a little bit more contrast. You can see that there's a bit more detail in her hair. There's also a bit more in focus, simply because you're going to get more depth of field at 1.4. And that's going to be a lot more noticeable at something this close up than that full body shot that we looked at before. But there's also just more detail in her hair. Bit warmer skin tones. You can also see that, so these shots that I took, when I was using the f1.4 lens, I did adjust my shutter speed to account for the fact that I was shooting at 1.2 versus, 1.4 versus 1.2. However, the Sigma shots are just slightly darker, and the Sigma lens does not transmit quite as much light totally I mean, irregardless of the fact that it's obviously a 1.4 lens, which is not going to transmit as much light at 1.4 than 1.2, but even so, just overall, if you're shooting these lenses at the same aperture even, it transmits a little bit less light. So that could mean that you're using a slower shutter speed or a higher ISO in the same situation. Not a big difference, and with today's cameras that can handle high ISOs, it's probably not any type of deal breaker. I just wanted to throw that out there. But if we compare, if I can get to it here, the Canon to the Sigma again, just kind of do a side by side. You can see where you're getting a lot more detail, especially, I mean, you can notice it in the eyes obviously, but even in the hair. And yes, again, there is greater depth of field at the 1.2 versus, or the 1.4 versus the 1.2, because, you know, that depth of field is deeper, but this isn't all out of focus just because there's a shallow depth of field. I mean, there's not that much difference in the depth of field. This is all just greater detail here on the Sigma because it can resolve more detail. And you can see that kind of in her eyes and her mouth too. Both are definitely clearly usable shots. It's just that we're seeing a little bit more detail in the Sigma. So then the last one we're going to look at is going to be the RF version, the 51.2 RF lens. And this is the same shot. And this one, if we zoom in, it almost looks 3D. At least when it initially pops up in that full one-to-one view. It's the sharpest of the three. It's not overwhelmingly more sharp or more detailed than the Sigma, but it definitely is showing the most detail in those eyelashes and those eyebrows. We are seeing again that slightly shallower depth of field again due to f1.2, but we can also see that there's a lot more detail in her hair there than there was at the original EF 51.2 lens. So that's showing that it's not necessarily the depth of field that was affecting the 51.2, it's just the fact, or the original one, it's just the fact that it can't resolve quite as much detail on that sensor. So here we can see a lot more detail in her hair. So that's that particular picture. And then the last one I did was a landscape orientation shot where she's sitting here, and she has her head turned towards me, but it's not completely turned towards me, so obviously one eye is behind the other and a bit out of the plane of focus, which is fine. I wanted it to be that way. So this is the EF lens. If we zoom in on her eye, we can see that we do see her eyelashes. This is focused. We can see that her back eye is slightly less focused just because it's a little bit behind the original plane of focus, or the intended plane of focus. There is also a bit of purple chromatic aberration that we're seeing on those stars on her shirt. Again, easily fixable in post-processing. The way that I like to do it is actually to use the sliders in Lightroom under lens correction, not just check that box that says remove fringing or remove chromatic aberration or whatever. It never works for me. I need to actually do the sliders, but it's a very easy fix. So this is sharp, this is usable. Again, maybe not a shot I'd always shoot at 1.2, but this is definitely a picture that I could use. You know, got this nice blur behind her. This is the Sigma, again, as we're seeing, just slightly warmer, a little tiny bit darker, but not that much. Again, also a little bit of a wider view. Oh, there's sirens outside. If we do a side-by-side on the Sigma and the original Canon here, I'm just going to point out a couple things about the blur. Like, this is right here. Even though we talked about where the Sigma seems to have overall smoother blur, which is true, you can definitely see that the aperture does affect the size of the out of focus points of light. Like here, the Canons are clearly larger at that 1.2. This area right here is a lot larger than this here. These are minor details, again, that only photographers probably notice. But sometimes those little things can add up, and it depends on really what you're looking for. overall in a lens. So just those small things. And you can also see too that the Sigma has more contrast here, or really overall, but you can see that contrast kind of pop up in this grass in the foreground, whereas there's a little bit less contrast on the Canon. So then the last picture we're going to look at is the Canon RF version of this picture. This is, again, the Canon RF version. Nice color. If we zoom in on her eyes, very sharp. There's so much resolution here that even though this back eye is not necessarily really in the plane of focus, it's a little bit softer, it's still got a good amount of detail in it. Again, it doesn't look as sharp as the front eye, but it's almost like a trick photography. I don't even know how to say it. I mean, obviously the overall depth of field is the same at 1.2 regardless, but one thing I noticed on this lens, and I'm going to compare it to the original Canon, although you can see when you compare it to the Sigma as well, is that the Canon RF lens, which is on the left, seems to have a lot more vignetting, or darker vignetting. If you zoom in here in the corners, I don't know how well you can tell, but it is darker, wide open than either of the other lenses. If I go back and forth, actually it's not going to do it. Hold on, I'm going to go into the develop module. This is the, hold on, I'm going to zoom in. This is the RF picture. So that's the histogram for the RF right here. And you can see like these are the, obviously the dark areas. Part of what is included is just all this stuff on the side, which is naturally dark in the background, but part of that is just also the vignette. This I have not added lens correction, and this is the vignette from shooting the lens wide open. And then this is the EF 51.2, and you can see how the area here on the sides, you know, on the side, just kind of that where a vignette would normally be, is not as dark, and that's also reflected in the histogram if you go back and forth. You see how that histogram changes? I mean, it kind of changes overall. The RF 51.2 is actually slightly darker overall. It's not as, it does, I guess it does probably transmit a little bit less light too. Not a ton less, but it's just the vignette that's a lot more noticeable. Again, if we go back and forth, camera 1, camera 2, camera 1, camera 2. One other thing that I wanted to show you, if we compare side by side of the Canon EF lens to the RF lens, or even the Sigma, is I know I'd showed you that crazy out of focus bokeh balls in the original picture, but also if you look at even if you look at anything kind of out in the corners on the original Canon here, you can see that it's got this weird look, and that's, I know I keep saying that the original Canon 51.2 has a very characteristic look. This is probably what contributes to it, because it's got this wonky look to out of focus stuff. And see how this just looks very different. This looks a lot smoother, whereas this looks, I don't even know what the word is that I'm trying to find. It looks like these weird straws or something that are sticking up. This is just a bit more smooth. I don't really think that one is better than the other. I kind of do like, I guess, the smoother blur, and it's not extremely noticeable unless you zoom in, but it's just something to point out where those corners, especially on the EF lens, or the edges, when you look at blur, look very interesting. Overall, these three lenses are all amazing. My heart really lies with the two Canons, just because I have always loved the look of Canon lenses. I love how accurately they focus. I really don't ever get out of focus shots with my Canon lenses, ever. It's basically 100% in focus all the time, which is great. If you're shooting with a DSLR, obviously your choices just are going to lay in anything that's an EF mount lens, you know, anything that will fit on a DSLR. You can't put those mirrorless lenses, they don't retrofit on the DSLRs, whereas you can take the DSLR lenses and put them on mirrorless with the adapter. But they're all great lenses. Obviously, there are some differences in performance or just looks overall that I've shown you here. Just a couple other factors. There's obviously a price difference between the three of them. The Sigma Art is the cheapest. It's probably around $700-ish, depending on when and where you buy it new. If you buy it new, the Canon 51.2 original one, I think, is like, I don't even, maybe like $1,100 now. I don't really even know. When I bought it, I think it cost $1,300. That was a ton of years ago, which I thought was a crazy price. And it kind of is. It's obviously an expensive lens. It's a good lens. It's been with me so many places. So that one's quite a bit more than the Sigma. If you buy it used, it can be found for less. And then the RF 51.2 new is like, I think $2,100 or $2,200 at least, which is not cheap. That's not a cheap lens. The RF mount lenses are really expensive. Again, I found it for a lot less than that. I found a really killer deal that I kind of just happened on, and I said, let me see what I can do. I'm going to try this lens, see how it works, and I really love it. But obviously, if you don't, again, I said if you don't own mirrorless, that lens is moot. Even if you do have a mirrorless lens, the question is out there, does it make sense to spend 3 times as much on the RF mount lens when the Sigma Art is kind of very close in performance to it? Even the EF lens, don't get me wrong, I love that EF lens. It looks beautiful. But if you're looking at the two that look the closest together, let's just compare, for example, this picture. Hold on one second. We'll look at the RF and the Sigma next to each other. Okay, if I can get my act together here. So these are these two lenses, and they are very, 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 very close in their performance, in what they resolve, and everything. They're so close. And the one thing that I notice is that the Canon focuses a bit faster. Oh, look at that. Miley Cyrus and Caitlyn Carter have split up. Just came on the news. The Canon focuses, I think, a bit faster and more accurately. Even though the Sigma Art works better on mirrorless than it does on my DSLR, I do think that the Canon, for me, just feels a bit better. It focuses a lot faster. When I say a lot faster, that's kind of a lie. It does focus faster, but not that much faster. I've seen other blogs or videos that people have done that have shown that the Sigma actually does focus faster than the RF lens. So that may just be me. I don't know if it's just my experience, what I was focusing on, if it's my copy of the lens, what have you. It's not so much of a difference that, again, I would feel that it was a deal breaker in any way or anything like that. I just think it's a thing to point out. I will say that the EF lens is probably the slowest to focus out of all three. But it's not so slow that I was sitting there waiting for, grass to grow or anything. So if you do have mirrorless, this is the comparison that you have to look at. These look almost but not quite identical. A little bit of difference in color, a little bit of difference in sharpness, but that price difference is going to be the biggest. If you have a love for Canon lenses and you have a DSLR, I would absolutely say that 51.2, the original one, is beautiful. It has a look that is so completely unique. It's like nothing else. And if you have the money to spend on the RF lens and you have a mirrorless camera, go out there and get it, girl or boy. So, yeah, that was my video, just comparing those lenses. Just a few shots to kind of show the differences. Hope that you all found this helpful. Have a great rest of your day.